problem slips in. Well, what about the Marxists? Now, some of you might be thinking, Marxism, communism, really? Do you really think that's having an impact on our culture? It is. I mean, you think about North Korea, you think about China. These are dominant countries. And Understanding the Times, Jeff Myers reports that probably 1 out of every 5 people identify with communism. And then you start thinking about some of the states that don't necessarily identify with communism, but they do identify with socialism. You start to see a lot of these implications. In 2004, I took a mission trip to Russia. And so I was there. It was kind of right around March. And so they were kind of going through their election cycle. And so I'm in this household, and we're eating breakfast, and I'm watching the news. And I don't really know the numbers. Or I can recognize the numbers, but the language. And so I'm talking to my interpreter. I'm like, so what's going on in the election? And he's kind of pointing out, well, Putin's probably going to get reelected here, and this is going to happen. And at the bottom, there was a word, and then next to it said 18%. And I said, well, what's that word? And they go, that's communism. And I said, 18% of Russians want communism back? And they said, oh, yeah. They said, oh, yeah, they want it back. And I said, why? It's a failed attempt. If anywhere would know that communism doesn't work, it's the Russians. And he said, yeah, that's true. He said, but what you have to remember is there's a lot of people that grew up in Russia during communism, and they have a nostalgic memory. I mean, how many of us could identify that with, there's something in our life where we're like, man, that didn't work, but it was me, you know? I was like, I get that. I understood that. It was safe. It was comfortable. And I thought, man, that's crazy. In a system where it completely failed in Russia, 18% of the people still thought that it was a good idea. Frederick Engels said there's absolutely no room for either a creator or a ruler. So they're going to say, we just don't need God. God's not the problem. We don't need to focus on God. God's not going to help us, so we don't need to worry about it. When it comes to the question of Jesus, there is no need for Jesus the Savior. We can be our own Savior by overthrowing capitalism. So the problems in the world is the social constructs, the fact that we have the haves and the have-nots, the fact that we have the separation. We've got to overthrow that, and so we're going to have this conflict that we're going to move through this communistic system, and eventually everything will be equal in this utopian society. If you ask about revelation, where do we get information from? You Christians go to the Bible. Where do the Marxists go? They would say that we find it from Engels or Karl Marx, or more specifically today, they would say you need to read the Communist Manifesto, which, interesting enough, the Communist Manifesto was greatly influenced by Darwin's Origin of Species. You see some of these ideas lining up. Once again, Darwin had a profound influence on Adolf Hitler. He also had a profound influence on Karl Marx. Karl Marx, after reading Origin of Species, was so moved by it and so encouraged by it that he actually sent him his book, Das Kapital, because he said, you need to read this. I read yours. Yours is great. And the great thing about Origin of Species is it did what to God? It removed God. Well, when you remove God, you remove all morals. I mean, if there's nothing outside of you and me, then who's to say that we're right or wrong? It's just an arbitrary, pragmatic approach to society. I used this illustration with my students once. I said, so imagine that we're in a classroom, and I said, I'm going to leave the classroom, and I said, something happens, and there's no authority. There's no teachers, there's no principal, there's no superintendent. It's just this classroom. And I said, somebody breaks the rule. I said, what do you guys do? I said, is that person in trouble? Oh, yeah, they're in big trouble. I said, how? Who's going to enforce it? Well, I said, there's no teacher. Well, we go, there's no principal. Well, we go, there's no superintendent. There's no authority. Could they get in trouble? And they're like, no, I guess they couldn't. Why? Because there's nobody to enforce it. That's what Karl Marx wants. Hey, if there's no God, it's just your opinion versus my opinion. It's just arbitrary. And so he was a big fan of Darwin's Origin of Species because it removed the problem of God. They would say that the problem of humanity is that we have social class. We have the haves and we have the have-nots. There are some that have lots and there are some that don't have very much, and that's the ultimate problem. And they would say salvation is found in removing those in power. So if we could level the playing field, and if we could just remove this, and we could just have communism rule, then we would see this. If you ever get a chance to go to a communist country, or even to Russia, where you can see just the semblance of it, very interesting. We flew into Moscow, and then we took like a 3.5-hour bus ride to Vladimir, which Vladimir is like a very old city, and so obviously doesn't have a lot of updates, not a lot of renovation. And you're just driving down the street, and it's just box, box, box. There's no creativity. There's no ingenuity. There's no structure. You go, oh, that's a really nice building. That building's taller. That building's shorter. That building's wider. I mean, it's box, box, box. That's communism. It's all the same. And that's what Karl Marx believed. It's all the same. It's all shared. There's no buildings that are prettier than others. There are no buildings that are uglier than others. Everything is the same. That was the idea behind Karl Marx. Postmodernism. Postmodernism, when asked about God, it would say God is dead. Man has ceased to believe in God, and therefore God is dead. Now, postmodernism wants to deny that there's any meta-narrative, and it wants to say that there's really no truth, there's really no absolutes, because your opinion is, or I guess the truth is shaded by your opinion. Maybe you've heard this statement before, that the winner writes the history books. They love that statement because they would say, we really can't know anything for sure because everything is tainted by your interpretation. Now, there's something that's rather humorous in that statement, that you can't trust anything because it's been tainted by a person's interpretation. But what they want you to understand is their interpretation that they just told you. Do you see the humor in that? They want to tell you that there's no absolutes, except for the absolute that there's no absolutes. This is what we call a self-refuting statement. They want you to say things that contradict itself. So, for example, I can't speak a word of English, okay? That's funny because I can speak a word of English. There are no English sentences longer than 3 words. Okay, that's funny because I just spoke an English sentence longer than 3 words. And my favorite one, whenever you get to a sports team and they win the championship and they stick the microphone in front of the person, they say, how are you feeling? The person goes, man, I'm literally speechless. I'm like, well, no, not quite, because you just spoke. You know, you're not literally speechless. You know, but that's what postmodernism is. It's just this kind of this celebration of no absolutes, except for the one absolute, that there's no absolute, which falls apart. I always tell my students that if you ever meet a postmodernist or somebody who identifies with this idea of relativism, you don't argue with them. You don't engage in the conversation. You just continually ask the same question over and over again. And the questions you ask them is, what you just said true? Because the whole time that they're talking to you, they're trying to convince you that they're saying is true. All the while, they're trying to take away truth. And so I tell my students, don't engage, just ask the question, is what you just said true? Oh, that's interesting, social contradiction. Is that true? Well, no, that's interesting. Is that true? There's a great story. If you know who Greg Kokel is, he runs Stand to Reason Ministries out in California. And he has this amazing story. I remember hearing it the first time. I thought, that is just such a really cool story, and it really proves the point. So he was in a debate once with a professor at a school and university, California school, and this guy had his PhD. I don't remember his name, and Greg Kokel at the time was like, man, he's like, I don't even have my master's, and I'm debating this guy. Well, Greg Kokel took the position of that there is objective truth, there is right and wrong, and this professor was taking the position that everything is relative, there's no such thing as absolute truth, everything is interpreted by the reader and the author, and it's just, you can't know anything for sure. And so they're going back and forth during this debate. And Greg Kokel's like, man, he's like, this guy has a PhD. I don't have a master's. This guy teaches at this school. The kids love him. I'm a visitor. He's like, and plus, he's teaching the idea that there's no absolutes. There can be no wrong. He's like, I'm going to get thumped. He said, except for one thing. I had truth on my side. And so they go back and forth through the whole debate. And at the end of it, they were going to vote. There's about 300 students in this auditorium. And each student was going to vote. Who made the better case, Kokel or this professor? And Kokel gets up to give his closing arguments, and he says, this whole thing has been about whether truth exists or not. He says, now, when you vote, you're either going to vote for me, saying that I'm right, but if you vote for the professor, you're going to vote to say that he's right and I'm wrong, therefore I win because you prove that there is such thing as right and wrong. And at the end of it, only one person voted for the professor. Because they saw real quickly, in order to deny that truth exists, you have to affirm that truth exists. And this is where postmodernism falls apart, because you have this idea of everything is true. But the problem is that cannot be possible logically. If you ask a postmodernist about Jesus, they would say that he is a moral teacher, but really nothing more. I mean, that's really all Jesus is a moral teacher. He had some good things to say, gathered some followers. Maybe they'd be generous enough to say that he influenced society. He had a positive impact, but he was nothing supernatural. If you ask them about revelation, they would say there is no ultimate revelation rather than the revelation that is found within. And so they would say that we don't need to go to a book or a source. It's truly inside of us. If you ask them about humanity's problem, they would say that we are facing a dependency on meta narratives. We're focusing too much on the big story. There is no God story. There is no creation, fall, redemption, glory. There's just your story, and your story needs to be understood. And your story is your story, and his story is his story. And that's why you can have multiple truths. That's why you can believe what you want to believe, and they can believe what they want to believe, and it doesn't matter. Islam can believe that Jesus never died on a cross, and Christians can believe that he did die on a cross, and there's no contradiction here because it's your story and their story. But the problem is Christianity draws us in and says, no, there's this overarching story that frames all of history and frames the rest of the way that we live. There's this giant meta-narrative that says there are things that are true and there are things that are false. And you cannot have contrary viewpoints and both say that they're true. And if you ask them about salvation, they would say, if mankind were to remove the meta-narratives, then salvation will be found. Take away all of these meta-narratives, take away all of this information, just focus on your story. Which sounds really nice until you try it out in reality. I mean, if I have a student and they say, well, my meta-narrative, my story is that I believe I can fly, and if I believe I can fly, then I can fly. Well, that theory falls apart real quickly when you test it out because a person cannot fly without an outside agent helping them. There's implications to our worldview because we do live in a meta-narrative, and we do have implications with that.